Imagine a world where human beings are treated as mere objects, where their lives are entirely at the mercy of their owners. This was the harsh reality of slavery in ancient Rome, a society where the power of a master over a slave seemed almost limitless. But was it truly without any boundaries? Today, we're diving deep into a question that might surprise you. Were there things that even the most powerful Roman masters couldn't do to their slaves? Let's uncover the hidden limits, the rare protections, and the brutal truths behind one of history's most oppressive systems. Stick with me as we explore over 1,000 years of Roman history to reveal what life was really like for the enslaved, and what, if anything, held their owners back. When most of us think about slavery in ancient Rome, we picture a world of absolute control. Masters could force slaves to do grueling work, punish them harshly, or even take their lives without a second thought. And honestly, that image isn't far from the truth. Under Roman law, slaves weren't seen as people, but as property, tools that could speak. They had no rights in the eyes of the state, and their owners held immense power over every aspect of their existence. But here's the thing. Even in a system as cruel as this, there were some limits. Not many, and not always enforced, but they did exist. So, let's peel back the layers of history to understand what those restrictions were, how they came about, and whether they made any real difference in the lives of the enslaved. To start, we need to go back to the very beginnings of Rome. Slavery wasn't just a part of Roman society. It was there from day one. According to the ancient Greek historian Dionysius of Halicarnassus, Romulus, the legendary founder and first king of Rome, allowed citizens to sell their own children into slavery. That's right. Parents could turn their kids into property if they needed to. This shows us that slavery was woven into the fabric of Rome from its earliest days, over 1,200 years ago. But back then, Rome wasn't the sprawling empire we often imagine. It was just a small, humble town with a tiny population. The number of slaves was even smaller, and the gap between rich and poor wasn't as extreme as it would later become. In those early days, during the monarchy and the early republic, even the wealthiest Romans were often farmers who worked their own land. They might have owned a few slaves, but they labored side by side with them in the fields. This created a strange kind of closeness. When you're sweating under the same sun as someone, day after day, it's a little harder to treat them with outright cruelty. Of course, that didn't mean life was easy for slaves, but the personal connection sometimes softened the harshness of their situation. There was also a practical side to this leniency. If a master pushed too hard, a slave might snap, maybe even strike back with a tool in hand. And in early Rome, escape wasn't as impossible as it would later become. Rome's territory was small, and a neighboring tribe or settlement was often just a short walk away. A slave could slip away into the night and disappear, with little chance of being tracked down. So, masters in those early years had good reason to avoid being overly brutal. But as Rome grew, everything changed. By the 5th century, B.C., after centuries of wars and conquests, Rome had expanded into a massive power. Waves of prisoners from defeated lands were brought back as slaves, and their numbers skyrocketed. Historians estimate that by this time, slaves made up about 20% of the population. They became the backbone of the Roman economy, working in fields, mines, households, and even as entertainers or teachers. With so many slaves and so much distance between master and slave, that personal connection from earlier times vanished. Treatment of slaves got worse. much worse. During the entire Republican era, which lasted for centuries, there were no real legal limits on what a master could do to their slaves. If a master wanted to beat, starve, or kill a slave, the law didn't stand in their way. The only faint glimmer of hope came from a group of powerful officials called censors. Censors had the authority to step into any household and intervene if they saw extreme cruelty. They could even punish a master for going too far. But let's be clear, this wasn't something they were required to do. It was just an option, not an obligation. Censors weren't out there inspecting homes or looking for abuse. They only acted if a free citizen, not a slave since slaves had no legal voice, reported a problem. And even then, a censor could simply ignore the complaint. On top of that, the position of censor wasn't always active. They were elected only once every 5 years and served for just 18 months. That left long periods, sometimes over 3 years, where no censor was in office to help, even in theory. And here's a sobering fact. In the more than 400 years between the creation of the censor's office and the rise of the Roman Empire, there is not a single recorded case of a censor stepping in to protect a slave. It might have happened, but if it did, it was incredibly rare. Things shifted slightly during the imperial era, when Rome was ruled by emperors. There are a couple of famous stories where emperors, who also held censor-like powers, personally intervened to protect slaves. One incident happened at a fancy banquet hosted by a wealthy Roman named Vettius Pollio. During the event, a slave accidentally dropped and broke an expensive crystal goblet. Pollio was furious and ordered the slave to be thrown into a tank of deadly lampreys as punishment. But Emperor Augustus, who was a guest at the banquet, stepped in. Not only did he save the slave's life, but he also granted the man his freedom. As a final slap in the face to Pollio, Augustus ordered all the other crystal goblets in the house to be smashed right in front of him. In another case, Emperor Hadrian took action against a Roman woman named Umbricia. She had savagely beaten a young slave girl over a minor issue, and Hadrian exiled her from the city for 5 years as punishment. These stories stand out because they're so unusual. They show that while emperors and censors had the power to protect slaves, they almost never used it unless the abuse was public and impossible to ignore. As time went on, a few laws were introduced to place small limits on a master's power. Around 4 B.C. and 2 B.C. Laws called the Lex Aelia Sentia and Lex Fufia Canina set rules on manumission, which is the act of freeing a slave. These laws restricted how many slaves a master could free at once, especially through a will. Later, under Emperor Claudius, a new rule said that if a master abandoned a sick slave and the slave recovered on their own, that slave would automatically gain their freedom. Masters were also required to bury their deceased slaves. If they refused, someone else could do it, and then sue the master for the cost. Let's say around $50 in today's money, depending on the burial, in 61 A.D. The Lex Petronia made it illegal for owners to send their slaves to be torn apart by wild animals without a judge's approval. Emperors like Domitian and Hadrian banned the castration of slaves, a cruel practice that was sometimes done to make them more manageable. By 161 A.D., Emperor Antoninus Pius passed a law against the unjustified killing of slaves. If a master was found guilty of deliberately murdering their own slave, they were held to the same standard as if they had killed someone else's slave. They could face a fine, maybe equivalent to $1,000 today, and had to pay the value of the slave, which could be another $2,000 or so, depending on the slave's skills or age. Later, in 319 A.D., Emperor Constantine took it a step further, making the intentional killing of a slave equal to murdering a free person. But there was a catch. Both of these laws only applied if the killing was clearly intentional, like stabbing a slave with a knife or throwing them off a cliff. If a slave died from normal punishments, like being whipped to death, the master faced no consequences. Harsh, right? Beyond these laws, Roman contracts for buying and selling slaves sometimes included special conditions to protect them in small ways. There were 4 common clauses that could be added to a sale agreement. One, called ne manumittitor, meant the buyer couldn't free the slave. A seller might add this to ensure an elderly slave, for example, wouldn't be freed and left without care, since masters had to provide for their slaves. If a slave was too old to work, some owners would free them just to avoid the cost, maybe $100 a year in today's terms. Another clause, ut manumittitor, required the buyer to free the slave after a certain time. The ut seu exportatur clause forced the buyer to take the slave out of a specific city or region and never bring them back, even if they were freed later. Breaking this could mean the slave would be re-enslaved. Finally, the non prostitutur clause banned the buyer from forcing a female slave into prostitution. If this was violated, the slave could be freed, and her original seller would become her legal protector. These clauses stayed in place, even if the slave was sold again, and breaking them could lead to fines of around $500 or more, depending on the contract. But let's not get the wrong idea. Even with these laws and clauses, life for most slaves in Rome was brutal. The few rules that existed weren't really about caring for slaves as human beings. Roman legal writings make it clear that these limits were mostly about keeping society stable and preventing unrest, not about kindness. Most slaves didn't have any special protections in their sale contracts. Those clauses only applied if a previous owner chose to include them. And even the strongest laws, like the ones against killing, were rarely enforced unless the crime was blatant and public. At the end of the day, Roman law saw slaves as tools, not people. The few restrictions that existed were just there to stop owners from breaking their tools in ways that might cause bigger problems for society. So, what couldn't owners do to slaves in ancient Rome? Honestly, not much. They couldn't kill a slave without reason under later laws, but only if the act was clearly intentional. They couldn't ignore certain contract clauses if they were in place, like those banning prostitution for female slaves. And in rare cases, a powerful figure like an emperor might step in to stop extreme cruelty. But for the most part, masters had almost total control. The limits were few, weak, and often ignored. Slavery in Rome, even at its best, was a system of unimaginable hardship, where the enslaved had almost no voice or hope. If you've stayed with me through this journey into ancient Rome, thank you so much. I hope this has shed light on a dark chapter of history and helped you see both the cruelty and the rare, faint glimmers of restraint in this system. If you found this story compelling, please give it a like and consider subscribing. We've got a dedicated team working hard to bring you content like this every week, and we'd love to have you join us as we explore more corners of the past. If you'd like to support our work, and help us create even more videos. Please leave a comment below sharing what you would like to watch here in the channel. Every bit of support means the world to us. You can also leave a super thanks below if you'd like to give a little extra help. It really keeps us going. Thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. Have a wonderful day.